so much of the modern stuff, the modern kind of ideas come, they're downstream from Dante, and and some of the influences that Dante had, and then of course you have the influence of dispensationalism and all of those things. Dante himself, he was very influenced by the Mediterranean mythologies and so on that he was familiar with, and he's already blending those things in for his own purposes. He's an artist in that fashion. And I, by the way, agree with Dante that the center of hell is cold. See, but
for very personal reasons. Is that very personal reasons for why you believe it's cold?
Cold is awful for me.
If you close your eyes and you imagine the end of the world, what do you see happening? Is it something that you think is based on the Bible? Are there beasts and dragons and fights and the obliteration of all material? If so, do you know where that comes from? Is that based on a biblical idea, or is that coming from somewhere else? And if it's coming from somewhere else, did it come from somewhere else into the Bible, or from the Bible into something else? How do we sift apart these ideas of the end of the world that seem to be all over the place all the time? Hey, I'm Jordan for Bible and Archaeology. I'm so happy today to be joined by Dr. Jason Staples for a discussion about where our ideas of the end of the world came from and why it matters that you try to parse apart these things, whether you believe these events are going to take place or not. If you're looking for a much deeper dive into this, you're in luck, because Jason is going to be teaching a class all about this, Visions of the End. There's a link down in the description. It's going to be 28 lectures. You're going to get all of the bases covered for you. But today, we're going to start with just a taste. So settle in, and I hope you enjoy our conversation all about the end of the world. Jason, thank you so much for taking the time to come and talk today about a pressing issue, the end of the world. It is all around us, depending on where you live. Right now in Iowa City, it feels like it's the end of the world outside, but that might be a little bit of an over-exaggeration. So thank you for coming to talk about this thing that feels very pertinent to our lives today.
So why does it feel like the end of the world outside?
Because it's like 95 degrees and I don't know what percentage humidity. And if this isn't hell, I don't know what that temperature feels like.
See, that temperature is heaven to me. Like for me,
man.
Ideal is 90 plus with high humidity, nice breathable air where it's nice and thick.
I can send this through to you, but I think this is a wonderful way into talking about the diversity of end of the worlds that the texts are actually talking about. So unintentionally on topic here, if we could start, I want to begin with just the general concept as a whole, because I think if we were to stop people today, if I was to go outside and ask people, what does the Bible say is the end? Like, what's the end of the Bible? Most people are going to point to like an idea that comes to them from whatever version of Revelation they know as this like culminating thing. But for you, as you look at the texts that make up the Bible, is that the end that the Bible as this corpus of things ever really had in mind until that part got added in?
Well, sort of a yes and no. I think the popular reading of Revelation, or as it pretty much as often as not is said, Revelations, as you'll get in virtually anything from Hollywood or television of any sort, you're going to get reference to the book of Revelations. And, those of us with any sort of biblical training or, familiarity start to twitch at that point. But no, a lot of the popular sort of readings of Revelation are, it's basically this idea that you have an end of the world scenario where basically everything blows up, and then there's a new heaven and a new earth, and you wind up with a new earth that has streets of gold and all sorts of things, and a city of various description within those final chapters. And the symbolism is absolutely there within the book of Revelation, but even in Revelation is remixing. It's hyperlinking to and remixing and mixtaping all sorts of material from earlier in the Bible for specific purposes. And if you don't have familiarity with the code that Revelation is using, then Revelation is maybe the easiest book in the Bible to misunderstand. It's right up there with them because it is using a code that it's expecting its readers to be able to kind of work with. And that's that is something. So on the one hand, yes, I think certain parts of at least of the Bible and of the early Jewish and Christian traditions are already headed in a lot of the same directions as Revelation. But no, also Revelation takes and remixes those things in various ways that are very distinctive.
If we strip away then some of those inherited layers that people are adding on, like the S and the Left Behind series and all of these versions of End of the World, I know for me that's the one that was beat in. You watched the movies, those books were around, and it's impacted so many other things. If we can take all of that away to say, let's look at some of the code and the layers sitting behind this, turning towards Hebrew Bible texts. In that code, what stands out to you maybe the most? Oh, here's some of the most glaring ones for you that you go, I wish that people knew this part about this because it changes X, Y, or Z.
Yeah, I mean, I think one is that a lot of the symbolism of the destruction of the cosmos, these sorts of things, the apocalyptic imagery that people are familiar with, that imagery was understood very much symbolically in these traditions. Now, that doesn't mean that some people didn't expect there to be a global conflagration of some sort. I mean, you see that in 2 Peter, for example, which is, it has what appears to be very stoic ideas of the burning away of the material cosmos in some sense, and the fixing of it towards rationality of some sort, or towards the spiritual fix. But the idea that these things represent functionally the end of the world, that matter and everything else is just going to cease to exist, and then there's going to be this disembodied existence afterwards. I would say that's probably the most common misunderstanding that we see. You do have ideas of transformed existence. You do have ideas that, the bad parts of matter may be burned away or whatever. The evils of the world will be destroyed. But you don't have this expectation of, okay, the world just kind of goes poof, and then everybody just spends time, playing their harps in this ethereal, disembodied existence. That's just not what we see in these traditions as a rule.
What is it that we see them looking for or them hoping towards instead if that idea of the poofing, the disappearing of all the material things is gone? Is there an idea of that hope for a future that we should be reading into these things that is more accurate?
Yeah, I think two of the things that I'll be focusing on in this class actually really have to do with that. And one is the idea, I think the central idea that underlies the various forms of biblical eschatology and apocalypticism in particular is the conviction that God is just, and that in the end, other details may vary, but ultimately everybody and everything is going to get what they deserve, and that God is going to set things right to how things ought to be, and everything's going to work according to its proper design, as opposed to, the various warped and twisted and crooked ways that things have gone. And so that, I think, is number one. And number two is that this, and this kind of goes hand in glove with that, is, there's the old German phrase, Urzeit und Endzeit, this idea of the beginning time and the end time match. So when you look at the sort of biblical idyllic idea of what the end looks like, it looks an awful lot like Eden. It looks like Eden, but with mature, fully developed humanity, no longer subject to the kind of temptation and fall that you see from Eden. So the whole story is kind of coming full circle, that you start in Eden, where humanity is established for a particular role, and then you end by returning. I mean, and that is actually the end of the book of Revelation. Is the city is set up, and in the city you don't have need for a temple anymore, but you do have the tree of life at its center. Oh, well, that should sound familiar, right? The new city that you see is actually the heavenly garden of God that has been brought to earth so that everything is as it ought to be. So, I think those first pages of Genesis set the template for what idyllic and ideal look like for the design. Mm-hmm. And in many ways, they're seen as a sort of a prevision of what is coming later, what's coming at the end. And actually, one thing you could take even further is that whereas in the Garden of Eden, the garden is only one part, and everything outside the garden seems to just be, still undeveloped land or untouched land with respect to the human creatures that God has set up to be the sovereigns over creation, his representatives of creation. What I think you see at the end is the idea that the garden has grown, and that the entire world will be like the garden was supposed to be, and that this is actually filling the earth. That's the plan. That's been the plan. The target all along is be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth and subdue it. And that's of course not from the Eden narrative. That's from the first chapter of Genesis. But they're read together, and then you see that vision that God brings about that vision through all of the twists and turns that you see in the narrative. And I think that's really where things are designed to go, and that so much of the rest of biblical literature and the early Jewish and Christian traditions are working with that kind of template, with that kind of coding, basically.
Is there a period of time where you feel like that template, is it always there? Or is there a moment where we can see this template in this reading start to really pick up steam on that idea of, like, is there a break point where people go, hey, those that did wrong now are getting away with it, and we need them to have a punishment that brings in those parts that you're pointing to say, maybe we've had this and we've overlooked it? Or do you really see it as existing always in those texts and growing to a different, like, flourishing level at a later point in time?
That's a hard question, because now we're dealing with the question of the development of the tradition on a historical front in ways that I tend to be deeply agnostic about, honestly. Mm-hmm. I think there is a lot of overconfidence among some of my, say, Hebrew Bible colleagues who are convinced that we can not only identify but date specific layers of texts and things in ways that I've never been really convinced that we can do that with a lot of reliability, especially since the proposed dates of different scholars often are 2 or 3 centuries apart. And we're talking critical scholars, not just, scholars who are committed to specific ideological or, faith traditions. So I'm pretty pessimistic about our ability to do that. But what I do think is that at least by the time we see things really starting to develop at our earliest evidence of things outside the texts, in sort of the early Persian period, so immediately following the Neo-Babylonian period, where you have the Babylonian exile and all of those things, I see a lot of these sorts of things already there in some fashion by the time we get to those early to mid Persian period times. And I think that's when a lot of our biblical texts are being finalized, is in that period. And since I'm pretty agnostic and pessimistic about our ability to reconstruct when exactly those shifts are happening and what changes they made to their texts, my answer is I don't know whether or not those things were present in some of those texts beforehand. I don't know what Genesis looked like, for example, or, if there's a version of Deuteronomy that goes back to, Hezekiah or pre-Hezekiah, how is that different from the version that is edited in the wake of and in light of the exile? Mm-hmm. I think we can make some guesses, but I think that's really what that boils down to in the absence of real hard evidence outside. So I do think you can also posit some of the influence of Zoroastrianism, and we could get into a long tangent about that, which was the official religious or cultic worldview and so on of the Persian Empire at the time. And there are certain things like in Zoroastrianism, you have the judgment of the righteous and the wicked. You have light and dark imagery. You have very strong dualism, and the world is divided into good and evil, and ultimately good will prevail. And your ethical position in the world determines which side you're on, but ultimately the highest God is going to bring things to a just conclusion. That looks an awful lot like what we see. Now, how much influence goes which direction? How much, I mean, a lot of the Zoroastrian materials that we have really are collected later. Now, how faithful are they to the stuff that's before? We don't really know for sure, but my suspicion is that there's a decent amount of cross-pollination that's happening in the early Persian period, and maybe a little bit before that, that is already working with that. And then in the Neo-Babylonian and Neo-Assyrian periods, you already have a mythological framework that a lot of these texts are already iterating on, that we see in, say, like the Gilgamesh epic and the Atrahasis epic and things that we've found, where it's like, oh, you have the chaos dragon here, and you have the high god ultimately bringing order, and then this leads up to some sort of end that banishes wicked or the evil, or at least chaos. I think there's some pretty significant differences between those ancient Near Eastern texts and what we see in the Hebrew Bible. But again, you already are seeing things that are going back and forth there in ways that suggest that, at least at the early stages, there probably are some of these things. How developed, I don't think we can know.
And that question of, as you're noting, the back and forth, what goes one way versus the other, is always a spot where I think people can get frustrated that scholars go like, we can point to things, but pointing to directionality is a whole different thing. But when you hear people talking about this, modern conversations about the end of the world or the end times that present often this like corrupted amalgamation of something from the Bible, plus, do you feel like it picks up accidentally a lot of these other things that are floating around in that Zoroastrian or other space that feels kind of close enough to some of what they might know over here that people blend those without really noticing that they're blending that when they're trying to present a biblical idea of what they think the end is? Yeah,
I do think that's the case. I think when you read, so much of the modern stuff, the modern kind of ideas come, they're downstream from Dante. And some of the influences that Dante had, and then downstream further from some of those other things. And then, of course, you have the influence of dispensationalism and all of those things. But, the people who are working with those things, Dante himself, he was very influenced by the Mediterranean mythologies and so on that he was familiar with. And he's already blending those things in for his own purposes. He's an artist in that fashion. And I, by the way, agree with Dante that the center of hell is cold. But for very personal reasons. Is that very personal reasons for why you believe it's cold?
Cold is awful for me. I don't like cold. But I think there's already, again, there's kind of like a cross-pollination about some of these things from the ways that these things get rolled back into traditions that in some ways get you closer, but they're also farther away. It's just, it's a whole different thing. And it's fascinating to do the kind of spade work to go, well, where did that come from? Why do they, that comes from Virgil, which comes from Virgil interacting with traditions associated with the Odyssey, and then that gets rolled into Dante. But the Odyssey traditions seem to be going back to some of the ancient Near Eastern type things as well, that, there is some cross-pollination here, that you're working with a lot of the same kind of soup, a lot of the same kind of mythological,
symbolism and such that work together. And, this is where, someone like Carl Jung would have a field day with this, but, and did to some degree have a field day with this. But, I think, again, there are some pretty significant differences between what we see at the early Jewish level and in earliest Christianity and in the biblical texts than what you get in their interpretations today, especially since modern people, a lot of modern Westerners in particular, we're urban people who are not the problems that we have are common human problems, but the way that we envision what an ideal world looks like, oftentimes, yes, it's influenced by those things, but it is different because we don't have some of the same problems day to day that a lot of the ancient people did. We aren't dealing with some of the things that they are in those. And so, and one of the things, we tend to be very allergic in the West to the idea, for example, that those who are wealthy are potentially in real trouble, right? Well, naturally, because if you look around, we are the ones that would be in real trouble, like all of us. And the idea that, the wicked, not only will the righteous get what they deserve finally, but the wicked are going to go down for their stuff. We tend to be more allergic to those ideas than people in the ancient world, for whom that kind of divine violence was, much more of a get 'em than tends to be, the case for a lot of people today. So there are differences as well.
For someone who's thinking to themselves, the spade work idea of digging back through this stuff, for someone who says, I don't think this is real, I don't believe this is going to happen, why should I bother? Why should I care about trying to sort these traditions out from each other? Where do you start with those people? Because the impact of this, on the one hand, someone might have a faith position that this impacts because of the way they think about that. But the touch of this isn't just for people who have that type of position, because it's worked its way into so many different kinds of things. So how do you start to approach that for those types of questioners?
Yeah, I mean, I think part of this goes back to, I saw a post on social media a while back, and it was in response to some of these, the idea of teaching the Bible in public schools and so on. And of course, I'm teaching, biblical studies classes in a public university. And the idea that, should, people have to read the Bible in public schools and so on. And the answer was, well, yeah, of course. Do you want to understand Abraham Lincoln? Do you want to understand Shakespeare better? Do you want to understand like the references that are in basically every movie up until the 1990s or maybe through the 90s? Then yeah, you should know these things. And, it makes it better. But this particular post said that that it was a guy reflecting on his experiences, and he said, "Yeah, I took a class in a public school setting. It was on the Bible. It was like for English class or something like that, and our teacher made us read, pretty big portions of the Bible. And I had like an atheist or an agnostic classmate who initially chafed at this idea of like, why should I have to read this? And he said within 2 weeks, his tune had totally changed to, dude, have you seen all the stuff that's in here? Like, I'm picking up on so many more cultural references now. Like this is wild. Like I got to read more of this." So there's that. First of all, it has impacted the water that we swim in beyond what anybody realizes, first of all. Second of all, though, I think when literature and traditions last as long and with as much influence as these have, it's not because they don't touch on important human issues and important human questions and the deepest aspects of existence. The reason that we still read the Odyssey, the reason that there is a Chris Nolan movie coming out on the Odyssey, is because when you read this kind of stuff, it speaks to you in ways that make you go, oh, man, like, yeah, I can feel that. And it gives you a different set of eyes to kind of look at the world with. And I think that's one of the things that we are impoverished we're getting increasingly impoverished as a culture, because people aren't reading these sorts of things and reading these sorts of things from the ancient world in ways that we ought. Because it's impossible for me to get into your shoes and to think your thoughts and to feel your feelings. I can't do that. I can't know what it feels like to be you in a certain sense, like in a real sense. But there is a certain amount of approximation of that we can get through story and through reading and participating in someone else's thought processes as put forward in story. And, this is where, to bring another Chris Nolan thing up, Inception gets to this. When you go to a movie, when you participate in a video game, when you read a book, you are engaged in the phenomenon of shared dreaming where you're inside someone else's consciousness. And that has there's no way of doing that without it actually deeply impacting you in some way, because now you're not only seeing through your own eyes, you get the opportunity to see and experience and feel through someone else's eyes, even if it's through someone else's eyes through your own eyes to some degree. And so these stories, these themes, this gives you another language, another set of eyes, another way of kind of seeing the world that I think adds richness to the way that we experience the world and helps us understand a lot better. So even if you aren't from that world, I think this is the sort of thing that really makes a difference.
Well, if you are looking for more of this, you are in luck, because Dr. Staples is going to have 28 lectures all about this. If you want to get your elbows deep into the background, you can go to the link down below, Visions of the End, How Jews and Christians Imagined the End of the Age. There's going to be a wide breadth of things. So if you're thinking to yourself, I have questions that now were not addressed in, the 20 or 25 minutes here that we have, you are in luck. Go down, sign up. Dr. Staples, thank you so much for taking the time to come and talk about this. I appreciate you taking the time. I will try to send a little bit of this warmth your way. Happy to know that the end of my world is not necessarily the end of everyone's. Thanks for taking the time today.
Thanks so much. This was a great pleasure.